Officer Miller never imagined a perfect Saturday afternoon would shatter into his worst professional nightmare. The sun was a warm hand on the back of his neck, the scent of popcorn and freshly cut grass mingling in the air at the annual community fair. Families spread out on blankets, children chased each other with shrieks of laughter, and the world felt simple, safe. This was the part of the job he loved, the connection, the community, the chance to show people the other side of the uniform. And today, the star of the show was his partner, Shadow. The Belgian Malinois sat beside him, a statue of coiled energy and perfect discipline. His black-tipped fur shone like polished obsidian in the sunlight, his intelligent eyes scanning the crowd with an unnerving focus that always drew a mixture of awe and fear. The demonstration had been flawless. Shadow moved with a liquid grace that belied his power, executing every command with a precision that made Miller's chest swell with pride. He'd run the obedience course, his paws barely seeming to touch the ground. He'd completed the scent detection trial in record time, locating the hidden training packet under a flurry of overturned boxes, with an excited, triumphant bark that made the children clap. Miller narrated each step, his voice calm and steady through the microphone, explaining the years of training, the unbreakable bond, the trust that formed the foundation of their partnership. He saw Shadow not just as a dog, but as an extension of himself, a living, breathing embodiment of duty and control. He had molded this animal from a rambunctious puppy into a finely tuned instrument of law enforcement. Also, he thought, the final part of the demonstration was always the crowd favorite, the apprehension simulation. A younger officer, Jenkins, was already jogging onto the field, padded from head to toe in a ridiculously bulky bite suit. He played the part well, taunting and shouting, creating the illusion of a volatile threat. Miller led Shadow to the temporary holding cage at the edge of the demonstration area, a standard procedure to build anticipation and ensure perfect positioning for the final run. The cage was reinforced steel, the latch heavy and secure. Shadow entered without hesitation and sat, his gaze fixed on Miller, waiting for the one word that would unleash the storm. Miller clipped the microphone back to his vest. He took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The crowd was hushed, their phones held up to record. Jenkins was in position 50 yards away. Everything was perfect. "Ready, boy?" Miller murmured, his hand resting for a second on the cool metal of the cage. Shadow's tail gave a single, tight thump against the floor. But then, something changed. It was a shift so subtle Miller almost missed it. Shadow's ears, which had been locked forward on Jenkins, swiveled slightly to the right. His head tilted. A low, almost inaudible rumble started deep in his chest. It wasn't the eager, pre-launch growl Miller knew well. This was different. It was laced with something else, a note of anxiety that sent a cold spike of unease through Miller's gut. He followed Shadow's gaze. The dog was no longer looking at the bite suit. He was staring intently into the crowd, past the front row of excited kids, past the smiling parents, to a solitary figure on a park bench under the shade of a large oak tree. It was an elderly man, his head slumped forward as if he were napping. He wore a simple tweed jacket, even in the mild warmth, and a flat cap that shadowed his face. He was utterly still. Miller frowned. He'd seen the man earlier, sitting alone, watching the world go by with a quiet, placid expression. Now, Shadow was fixated on him with an intensity that was profoundly wrong. "Shadow, watch him," Miller commanded, his voice sharp, tapping the side of the cage to redirect the dog's attention to Jenkins. "Watch him." Shadow didn't respond. He didn't even blink. The rumbling in his chest grew louder, vibrating through the metal frame. His body went rigid, every muscle tensed not for a chase, but for something else. His hackles were not raised in aggression, but there was a strange, desperate energy radiating from him. Miller felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This had never, ever happened. Not once in 4 years of service. Shadow's discipline was absolute. His focus was unbreakable. This was a malfunction, a catastrophic error in the system he had built. Shadow, heel, Miller tried again, his voice lower now, laced with a warning. The dog was trained to obey without question. But the dog was deaf to him. He was in another world, connected by an invisible thread to the sleeping man on the bench. Then, with a surge of power that stunned Miller, Shadow lunged. Not toward the door, but against the side of the cage, his full 85 pounds of muscle and bone hitting the steel mesh. The cage rocked violently. "Shadow, no!" Miller shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. Before he could move, before he could process the complete breakdown of protocol, Shadow lunged again. There was a horrific sound, a sharp, metallic crack like a breaking bone that echoed across the suddenly silent park. The heavy-duty latch, designed to withstand immense force, had snapped. The cage door flew open. For a heart-stopping second, Shadow stood there, framed in the opening, a whirlwind of unleashed potential. And then he was gone. A black blur, moving with a speed that seemed impossible, not toward the waiting bite suit, not toward the open field, but directly, unerringly, toward the elderly man on the bench. The collective gasp from the crowd was a physical force, a wave of sound that hit Miller like a punch. It was followed instantly by a cacophony of screams. The idyllic Saturday afternoon shattered into a million pieces of raw, primal fear. People scrambled backward, a panicked surge of humanity tripping over blankets and picnic baskets. Parents grabbed their children, shielding their eyes from the scene they were sure was about to unfold: a police-attacked dog, a lethal weapon, mauling a helpless old man. Miller's blood ran cold. His mind, usually so clear and methodical under pressure, became a whirlwind of static and horror. This was it. The nightmare scenario every K9 handler plays over and over in their head. The one-in-a-million failure. A dog turning, breaking training, becoming the very monster they were trained to hunt. He saw the headlines already printing themselves behind his eyes. K9 Savage's elderly man at community fair. He saw his career dissolving into dust, his badge stripped away, his partner labeled a menace to be put down. "Shadow! Stop! Down!" he roared, his voice raw with a desperation he'd never known. He sprinted after the dog, his feet pounding on the soft turf, his lungs burning. The commands were useless, swallowed by the noise and the distance. Shadow didn't falter. He was a missile locked on its target. The crowd parted before him, a sea of terrified faces. All Miller could see was the dog's powerful form closing the distance to the bench, to the still, slumped figure, who remained oblivious to the approaching danger. The man hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched at the screams. He hadn't lifted his head. He just sat there, a fragile island in a storm of chaos. The crowd's terror was infectious. They saw an old man frozen by fear, a sheep before the wolf. Miller saw only the terrifying endpoint of his failure. He was running not just to stop his dog, but to stop the future he saw spooling out in front of him, a future of ruin and regret. But as Shadow reached the bench, something happened that didn't fit the narrative of violence. He didn't leap. He didn't snarl or bite. He skidded to a halt, his claws digging into the grass, stopping so abruptly that his back legs nearly slid out from under him. He stood before the man, his body trembling, and let out a sound that cut through the screams and straight into Miller's soul. It was a whine. A high, thin, keening sound, full of a desperate, heartbreaking anxiety. It was the sound of a creature in distress, not of an attacker. Miller slowed, his sprint turning into a cautious, confused jog. He was still 20 yards away, but he could see the scene clearly now. Shadow nudged the old man's limp hand with his wet nose, a gesture so gentle it seemed impossible from the animal that had just burst through a steel cage. He nudged it again, then looked over his shoulder, his dark eyes finding Miller's. It wasn't a look of defiance. It was a plea. A desperate, silent scream for help. The world seemed to slow down. The noise of the crowd faded to a distant buzz. The narrative of an attacked dog gone rogue flickered and died, replaced by a question mark so large it filled Miller's entire consciousness. What was happening? He approached the bench, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear of his dog, but with a dawning, chilling sense of a different kind of emergency. "Easy, boy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "What is it? What's going on?" He kept his movements slow, non-threatening. He was no longer trying to control an aggressive animal, he was trying to understand a frantic messenger. He rounded the bench to face the elderly man, and the last vestiges of his anger and fear evaporated, replaced by a sharp, professional alarm. The man's face was ashen, a ghastly, pale grey. A film of clammy sweat beaded on his forehead and upper lip, glistening in the dappled sunlight. His lips had a bluish tint. His head was slumped onto his chest at an unnatural angle, and his breathing. Miller leaned closer. It was frighteningly shallow, a barely perceptible flutter in his chest. This man wasn't sleeping. He was unconscious. He was dying. And suddenly, everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. Shadow's agitation. His fixation. His desperate escape. His gentle nudging. The dog hadn't been breaking his training, he had been following a deeper, more profound training imprinted in his DNA and reinforced by years of scent work. He had detected a change in the man's biochemistry, the scent of impending medical crisis, of death. He had been trying to sound the alarm the only way he knew how. Miller felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had doubted his partner. He had seen a failure of discipline when, in fact, he was witnessing an act of profound, instinctual loyalty. Shadow, sensing the shift in Miller's demeanor, whined again and began anew, frantic behavior. He pushed his nose insistently against the pocket of the man's tweed jacket, nudging it over and over. Then, as if frustrated by the lack of response, he lay down abruptly, placing his heavy head and paws over the man's worn leather shoes. It was a gesture of guarding, of protection. His entire body was a taut wire of anxiety, a low tremble running through his powerful frame. He looked up at Miller again, his eyes wide with a desperate urgency. "Do something," the look screamed. "Please, do something now." Miller's training took over. The K9 handler receded, and the police officer, the first responder, took his place. He knelt beside the bench, his voice loud and clear. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" He placed 2 fingers on the man's neck, searching for a carotid pulse. He found it, but it was terrifyingly weak and rapid, a frantic, thready beat against his fingertips. This was bad. This was critical. He straightened up and bellowed, his voice cutting through the stunned silence that had now fallen over the immediate area. "I need a medic. Now? Somebody call 911. Officer down." He didn't know if the man was an officer, but it was the phrase that would cut through any confusion and signal the highest level of emergency. The crowd, which had been a roiling mass of fear, was now a gallery of stunned, silent onlookers. They were witnessing something they couldn't comprehend. The dog they thought was a monster was now a furry sentinel, refusing to leave the side of the very man he was supposed to have attacked. Event staff with radios started sprinting toward them. A woman in the front row, a nurse, pushed her way forward. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice steady. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Miller said, his gaze flicking between the nurse and the man's unnervingly still form. Faint pulse, shallow breathing, cyanosis. He's unresponsive. The nurse knelt on the other side of the man. "Let's get him on the ground, keep his airway open." As they gently tried to ease the man from the bench, Shadow acted again. A growl rumbled in his chest, low and deep. It wasn't the sound of aggression he used on suspects. It was a guttural warning, a sound that said, "Be careful. You don't understand." He didn't move from his position over the man's feet, creating a living barrier. "He won't let us move him," the nurse said, pulling her hands back cautiously. Miller looked at his dog. He saw the conflict in Shadow's eyes, the instinct to protect warring with his ingrained trust in his handler. "It's okay, boy," Miller murmured, putting a hand on Shadow's back. The dog's muscles were knotted with tension. "They are here to help." "It's okay." He looked again at where Shadow had been nudging so insistently, the man's right jacket pocket. There was a slight bulge. The dog's frantic focus on that one specific spot couldn't be a coincidence. He had been trying to point to it. "Wait," Miller said to the nurse. "He's trying to tell us something." He kept his hand on Shadow, stroking his fur, his voice a low, calming murmur. "Good boy. I see it. I see what you're showing me." Slowly, carefully, he reached into the man's jacket pocket. His fingers closed around something hard and plastic, and a small, laminated card. He pulled them out. The plastic object was a medical autoinjector, an EpiPen. The card, attached to it with a rubber band, had bold, red letters printed on it. "Anaphylactic alert," it read. "Severe allergy to bee or wasp stings. Administer epinephrine immediately. My name is Arthur Pendleton." Miller's blood turned to ice. Anaphylactic shock. It fit every symptom perfectly. His eyes darted around, scanning the ground near the bench. There, next to one of the legs, was a small puddle of spilled soda, sticky and sweet. And hovering over it, drawn by the sugar, was a single, fat honeybee. It had all happened so fast, so silently. A man enjoying a day in the park, a stray bee, a single sting, and now a race against death. The wail of a siren grew louder, cutting through the air. The park paramedics, who had been on standby for the event, were running toward them with their kits. "He's in anaphylactic shock," Miller yelled, holding up the EpiPen and the card. "Allergic to a bee sting." The information galvanized the paramedics into immediate, efficient action. The lead medic, a woman with a calm, authoritative face, took the EpiPen from Miller's hand. "We've got it," she said. "We need to get to him. Can you control your dog?" This was the moment of truth. Miller looked down at Shadow, who was still growling softly, his protective instincts on a razor's edge. He was guarding Arthur, and he didn't understand that these new people were there to save him. Miller knelt down, putting his face close to Shadow's. He didn't give a command. He spoke to his partner. "Shadow, look at me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it, boy. You found him. You told me. Now you have to let them help. You have to trust me. Let them help him." He put his arms around the dog's powerful neck, a gesture he rarely made outside of their private moments at home. He held him firm, but gently. "It's okay. I've got you. You did good. You did so good." Shadow looked from Miller's face to the paramedics, then back. The low growl subsided, replaced by another anxious whine. He didn't move from his spot, but the rigid tension in his body eased just enough. He was yielding, placing his trust in Miller completely. "Okay," Miller said to the medics, his arms still around his partner. "Go? Now?" The paramedics moved in swiftly. One tore open Arthur's shirt to place defibrillator pads as a precaution, while the lead medic pulled the cap off the EpiPen and firmly jabbed it into the man's thigh, holding it there for the prescribed count. The small crowd that had gathered closer gasped. They were no longer watching a potential dog attack, they were watching a desperate rescue, orchestrated by the very animal they had feared. The dog hadn't been the danger, he had been the first responder. The seconds after the injection stretched into an eternity. Nothing happened. Arthur remained terrifyingly still, his skin clammy and pale. The paramedic with the bag valve mask fitted it over his face and began forcing air into his lungs. Come on," she muttered, her knuckles white as she squeezed the bag. The only sounds were the rhythmic puff of the bag, the crackle of the radio, and the frantic, shallow beating of Miller's own heart. He held onto Shadow, burying his face in the dog's thick fur, unable to watch. He had brought this man to the brink, his dog, his partner. No, that wasn't right. His dog had tried to pull this man back from the brink. He felt a profound, gut-wrenching shift in his perception. He had always viewed Shadow's abilities through the lens of command and response. He gave an order, the dog obeyed. The world was a simple, binary system. But this was beyond that. This was instinct, empathy, a form of intelligence his human mind was too limited to grasp. Shadow had sensed a chemical storm inside a stranger's body from 50 yards away. He had defied every command, broken through a steel cage, and risked being seen as a monster, all to save a life. He hadn't just been obedient, he had been right. "I've got a stronger pulse," the second paramedic suddenly announced, his voice tight with excitement. "Respiration is improving." Miller's head shot up. He watched, his breath held, as a flicker of movement passed through Arthur. The man's chest gave a deep, shuddering heave, a convulsive gasp as his airways began to open. A faint tinge of pink started to creep back into his cheeks, chasing away the deathly grey. His eyelids fluttered. Then, slowly, they opened. His eyes were clouded with confusion, darting from the paramedic's face to the oxygen mask, to the circle of concerned strangers, and then down. His gaze fell upon the large, dark head resting on his lap. Arthur's hand, trembling violently, lifted from his side. He slowly lowered it until his fingers brushed against Shadow's fur. The dog, who had been a storm of anxious energy just moments before, became utterly still, accepting the touch. A weak, raspy voice emerged from the man's lips, barely a whisper. "The dog," he murmured. He saved me." A sound rippled through the crowd. It started as a few scattered claps, then swelled into a wave of thunderous applause. The fear and suspicion had been washed away, replaced by a flood of awe and overwhelming relief. People were smiling, some wiping tears from their eyes. They had witnessed a miracle, a small, perfect moment of interspecies heroism that defied all expectation. Miller finally let go of Shadow. He knelt on the grass, the strength draining from his legs, and wrapped his arms around his dog. He didn't care about the crowd, the cameras, the other officers. He buried his face in Shadow's thick ruff, and a single, hot tear escaped his eye, soaking into the dark fur. "You beautiful, brilliant animal," he whispered, his voice choked with an emotion so powerful it felt like it could break him. "You were right. You were right all along," Shadow responded by leaning his full weight against Miller, licking his cheek once, a gesture of shared victory and profound, unspoken understanding. The bond between them, once defined by handler and tool, had just been reforged in the fires of crisis. It was now a partnership of equals, a bond not of command, but of absolute, soul-deep trust. In the days that followed, the story of Officer Miller and Shadow became something of a local legend. The local news ran the headline, "Hero K9 saves man's life at community fair," accompanied by a photo of Shadow resting his head on Arthur Pendleton's lap as paramedics treated him. The police department was inundated with positive calls and emails. Instead of facing a disciplinary board, Miller was given a commendation. Shadow, the dog who had broken protocol in the most dramatic way possible, was honored in a special ceremony. He sat patiently on stage, occasionally licking Miller's hand, oblivious to the speeches being made about his bravery, his instincts, his incredible perception. For Miller, the public accolades were secondary. The true transformation was internal, a quiet but seismic shift in the foundation of his world. He could no longer look at Shadow and see a perfectly programmed machine. When he looked into those intelligent, amber eyes, he saw a consciousness, a partner who possessed a wisdom that went far beyond scent training and bite commands. He started watching Shadow differently, not just for signs of obedience, but for his subtle cues, his opinions. He learned to listen to the dog's silences, to trust the twitch of an ear or the sudden stillness that meant Shadow had noticed something his own human senses had missed. Their work on the streets became a true collaboration. Miller had the tactical knowledge and the authority. Shadow had the instincts of a predator and the heart of a guardian. Together, they were more effective than ever before. About a week after the incident, once Arthur Pendleton was home from the hospital and recovering, Miller decided to pay him a visit. He drove to the small, tidy house on a quiet, tree-lined street, not in his patrol car, but in his personal truck. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, sniffing the air with an air of happy curiosity. Miller felt a strange nervousness as he walked up the path. He wasn't sure what to say. "Thank you for not letting my dog get put down," seemed woefully inadequate. He knocked on the door, and it was opened a moment later by Arthur himself. The man looked a decade younger than he had on the bench. The ghastly pallor was gone, replaced by a healthy, pink complexion. He moved a little slowly, but his eyes were bright and full of life. He broke into a wide, genuine smile when he saw who was at the door. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice warm. "I was hoping you'd stop by." His gaze then dropped to the dog sitting patiently at Miller's side. Arthur's smile softened. "And you brought my hero." Before Miller could say a word, Shadow whined softly and stepped forward, nudging Arthur's hand just as he had at the park. This time, the hand was steady. Arthur crouched down with a slight groan and began stroking Shadow's head, scratching him behind the ears. "Hello, you clever boy," he murmured. "I don't think I ever properly thanked you." Shadow leaned into the touch, his tail giving a few slow, contented thumps against Miller's leg. Miller stood on the porch, watching the quiet, tender reunion between the old man and the dog who had saved his life. It was a scene of such simple, profound peace that it almost brought tears to his eyes. They spent an hour with Arthur, sitting in his sun-drenched living room. Arthur told them he was a widower, a retired history professor, who had lived in the town his whole life. He'd been stung by a bee that had crawled into his jacket sleeve while he was reading on the bench. He remembered feeling a sharp pain, a wave of dizziness, and then nothing. The next thing he knew, he was looking up at the faces of paramedics, with a dog's head on his lap. "You know," Arthur said, looking at Miller, "for years I've been a little afraid of dogs like him. You see them on the news, and they look so fierce, so dangerous." He reached down and ran his hand along Shadow's strong back. "But he wasn't fierce with me. He was insistent. He was my advocate when I had no voice." Those words resonated deep within Miller. My advocate when I had no voice. That was the truth of it. Shadow had spoken for a man who couldn't speak for himself. He had bridged the gap between life and death with nothing but instinct and a loyalty that transcended species. Time passed. The seasons changed. The incident at the park slowly faded from the headlines, but it never faded from Miller's mind. It became the defining moment of his career, of his life. What had begun as a day of routine demonstration, a showcase of control and discipline, had become a profound lesson in humility and trust. He learned that true partnership isn't about control, it's about connection. It's about recognizing that wisdom comes in many forms, and sometimes the most vital messages are delivered without a single word. He looked over at Shadow, now dozing at his feet in their quiet living room, his paws twitching as he chased rabbits in his dreams. He was more than a K9, more than a partner. He was family. He was a constant, living reminder that beneath the surface of the world we think we understand, there are deeper currents at play, instincts, connections, and a form of love that asks for nothing but to be trusted. The world is full of silent alarms and quiet cries for help. We just have to be willing to listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. Because sometimes, a hero doesn't wear a cape. Sometimes, he has four paws, a wet nose, and a courage so pure it can shatter steel and save a life. And if you're lucky enough to have a friend like that, you learn to trust them, especially when they break all the rules.